They called it justice. A verdict sealed in silence. A woman, found guilty of a crime she never defended herself against. Not a word spoken in her own defense. No plea, no explanation. Just the cold, echoing sound of the gavel and the weight of the sentence that would follow. Her punishment wasn't death. It was something far more disturbing. She was buried alive, not in soil, but in a cage beneath the earth. A prison so small she could never stand, so dark she could never see the sun again. For years, the world above went on. Children played in the fields, markets bustled with trade, while below, she rotted in silence. Forgotten. But this wasn't the Middle Ages. This wasn't some ancient barbaric ritual lost to time. This happened in a world that prided itself on law, morality, and civilization. And the chilling truth? The more you learn about this case, the less certain you'll be about who was truly guilty. This is the story of the woman entombed alive for life. It was the kind of trial that didn't just fill the courthouse. It filled the entire town with a fever. By dawn, the streets outside the old stone building were already choked with bodies. Merchants abandoned their stalls, mothers clutched children to their hips, and old men leaned on canes, determined to witness what they believed would be a moment of justice, and perhaps vengeance. Inside, the air was stifling. The tall windows, though open, barely stirred the heat. The scent of polished oak mingled with the rank odor of too many people breathing the same air in tense silence. At the center of it all, sitting alone at a battered wooden table, was the woman who had brought them here. She was young, but her face looked older, hardened, not by years, but by something heavier. Her dark hair hung limp over her shoulders. She did not raise her eyes to meet those who stared at her like she was an animal in a cage. She did not flinch at the sound of her name being called. She simply sat. The bailiff read the charges aloud, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Murder, mutilation, desecration of a corpse. The words rang like hammer blows. But the accused made no reply. The judge's voice was sharper, more impatient. Do you understand the charges brought against you? No answer. The clerk leaned forward, repeating the question. Still nothing. By the third attempt, the murmurs began, a low ripple of disbelief that spread across the benches. In this court, silence was not the right to remain quiet. Silence was an insult, a form of rebellion. It was as if she had turned her back on the law entirely. The prosecutor seized the moment, his voice rising with performative outrage. He painted the image for the jury with grotesque precision. Her husband, found in their modest home, his skull shattered by multiple blows from a heavy object. His body, he paused here, letting the word mutilated hang in the air, was barely recognizable as human. The coroner, he said, had refused to let the youngest apprentice assist in the examination, so disturbing was the scene. And then there was the matter of the dress. A neighbor had spotted her in the early hours, walking through the fields. Her clothing stained dark, her hands trembling. Blood tests were primitive in this time, but the smell of iron on the fabric had been enough for the sheriff to lock her in the town jail without hesitation. No weapon was ever found. No witness claimed to have seen the act. But in the minds of the people, the lack of explanation was worse than any confession. And she offered them nothing. The jury shifted in their seats, some glancing toward the judge for guidance. This was no ordinary case. Under the law, an accused who refused to plead could not be tried in the conventional sense. The usual answer to such defiance was pressing, a medieval holdover in which heavy stones were laid upon the body until the accused either entered a plea or died. But that punishment was a slow, public death, and there were whispers, ugly whispers, that this woman didn't deserve a public death. She deserved something worse. The judge, an older man with a weathered face, regarded her with something colder than anger. He had seen criminals beg, cry, and lie their way through trials. He had seen the guilty protest their innocence and the innocent break under accusation. But he had never seen this, a wall of silence so complete it felt almost inhuman. The silence began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just the absence of words. It was a presence in the room, an invisible force that made the jurors uncomfortable and the spectators restless. It was as if she had drawn a line in the sand and dared them to cross it. By the second day, the mood in the courthouse shifted. This was no longer about the murder itself. It was about her refusal to participate in her own trial. Every unanswered question deepened the townspeople's hatred. They began to see her silence as proof of guilt, arrogance, even evil. The prosecutor exploited it skillfully. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "innocence speaks. Innocence defends itself. Only the guilty hide behind silence." By the time he sat down, the verdict was no longer in doubt. But the sentence, that would be another matter. The judge did not want to hand her over to the traditional punishment of pressing, nor did he think prison was enough. He wanted her gone, erased from the world above. An old idea came to him, not in the law books, but in the whispered traditions of rural justice. The kind of punishment that served not just to destroy a person, but to bury their memory. It had been done before, though rarely. A cage, built of iron bars, just large enough for a person to sit or crouch, lowered into a pit deep beneath the ground. A hatch above to drop food and water, just enough to keep the condemned alive for a while. No daylight, no standing, no contact with the world. The body would eventually fail, but the mind, oh, the mind would suffer far longer. When the verdict of guilty was read, the townspeople erupted, not in cheers, but in a grim hum of satisfaction. Justice had been done, they told themselves. But no one spoke of the cage. Not yet. She stood only once that day, when they came to take her away. Her eyes swept the courtroom briefly, but did not linger on any one face. If she had anything to say, it remained locked away, as unreachable as she soon would be. And so it was decided. She would not hang. She would not rot behind bars. She would descend into the earth and never return. They called it justice. She left them with silence. The trial might have ended in the courthouse, but the story was far from over in the streets. If anything, the real sentencing happened outside, whispered in alleyways, shouted over ale in the taverns, and muttered behind closed doors where children pretended to sleep but listened to every word. This wasn't just justice for a single murder. To the people, this was the purging of something foul that had lingered too long in their midst. The town itself was small, a knot of stone buildings pressed together like a fortress against the fields that stretched endlessly beyond. Life here was hard. Winters bit deep. Summers burned crops to dust. People knew every neighbor's business, and every stranger was an intruder. But when something went wrong, something unspeakable, the need for a scapegoat became almost a reflex. And this was no ordinary crime. The victim had been a man of influence, though not in the way wealth makes someone powerful. He was a man who made himself unavoidable, chairing local councils, settling disputes, and inserting himself into every decision that touched the community. Some saw him as a peacemaker. Others saw him as a tyrant in the clothing of a friend. When he was found dead, the town didn't just lose a man. It lost the illusion of stability. His home, once a place of well-kept order, had been turned into a scene so grotesque that the sheriff later admitted he'd nearly vomited. The body was more ruin than flesh, and the blood had soaked so deep into the wooden floorboards that it could never be scrubbed away. Even after the case was closed, that house would stand like a wound in the town's memory. It didn't matter that there was no witness to the killing. It didn't matter that no one saw her strike the blows. What mattered was that she had been there, and that she didn't speak. In their minds, only a guilty person could hold such silence under accusation. And in a place like this, guilt wasn't proven by evidence. It was proven by the collective will to see someone punished. In the weeks before the trial, gossip had done the work of law. There were whispers of marital arguments, of her spending too much time alone, of her being seen with strange men on the outskirts of town. None of it could be proven, but none of it needed to be. The story they wove was simple. She had killed her husband in cold blood, and for reasons too dark to speak aloud. Some feared the usual sentence. A public hanging wouldn't be enough. A hanging was over too quickly. Some argued she didn't deserve even the release of death. And in those hushed conversations, the idea of the cage began to grow like mold in a damp cellar. It was an old form of punishment, passed down more in folklore than in law. Farmers told their children tales of thieves who vanished into the ground, their bones never found. The image of an iron cage, buried deep in the cold earth, became a warning. Cross your neighbors, and you might disappear without a grave marker. In truth, such punishments were rare. But in times of fear and anger, the rare became possible. By the time the judge decided her fate, the people had already made peace with the idea. In fact, Many had demanded it. There was a fever in the air, the kind that blinds men to mercy. The cage wasn't just about punishing her. It was about restoring order. It was about sending a message that silence, defiance, and the breaking of unwritten rules would not be tolerated. When the sentence was delivered, it was not announced in the open court. The verdict, guilty, was enough for public ears. The details came later, passed from mouth to mouth, each retelling making it darker, more certain, more satisfying. Soon everyone knew. She would be buried beneath the ground in a cage, kept alive just long enough to suffer, then left to the worms. And here, in the shadowed corners of the town, a strange thing happened. People began to imagine it. The women at the market spoke in low tones about the cold metal pressing against her skin. The men at the tavern wondered how long she'd last before madness took her. Even the children, who were warned not to repeat such things, whispered about it in the dark, daring each other to picture her face as the earth closed in. It was no longer about justice. It was entertainment, a performance in the theater of cruelty that the entire town could attend in their minds. But there was another layer to this hunger for punishment, one that no one dared to speak openly. Some, deep down, questioned the case. They wondered if perhaps she hadn't done it. They wondered if her silence was not defiance, but fear. And those who doubted were the loudest in calling for the cage. Because if they could bury her, literally bury her, they could bury their doubts as well. So the carpenters and blacksmiths began their work. They forged the bars, cut the wood for the frame, and prepared the pit. It was done quietly, under the guise of repairs to the storage cellars. No one would admit to knowing where the pit was dug, but everyone knew it was somewhere beyond the edge of town, near the woods where the earth was soft enough to yield to a shovel. By the time the work was finished, the town's mood had shifted again. Now, there was anticipation, a kind of grim excitement that a chapter of their lives was about to be sealed as completely as the woman they would entomb. The day came without ceremony. No parade of guards, no public display. She was taken from the courthouse in the dead of night, escorted by men who had volunteered for the task. Some carried torches. Others carried nothing but the weight of what they were about to do. In the taverns, the speculation turned to how long she would last down there. A week? A month? Longer? No one knew. No one cared. The point was that she would vanish, and the town would go on. But history is never that neat. The cage was meant to be the end of her story. In truth, it was only the beginning. The night they took her, the moon hung low and red, as if the sky itself had been poisoned. No one in the town was meant to see it happen, but people did. Curtains shifted in upstairs windows. Dark figures stood on porches, holding their breath as a small group of men led her down the narrow street toward the outskirts. She didn't struggle. She didn't resist when they bound her hands or when they forced her into the back of the cart. She sat with her head bowed, the flicker of the torches casting jagged shadows over her face. If fear lived inside her, she showed none of it. The journey was short, but it felt longer than it should have. The road wound through silent fields, the dirt crunching beneath wagon wheels. Beyond the fields, the land dipped into a wooded hollow, a place where the soil was soft, damp, and easy to dig. It smelled of moss and decay, the perfect place to hide something or someone. When the cart stopped, the men jumped down and began to work in grim silence. At the center of the clearing was the pit. It was deeper than a man's height and just wide enough for the iron cage that waited nearby. The cage itself was a crude thing, bars forged thick, welded together at uneven angles, with a low, arched top that made standing impossible. Inside, the floor was nothing but cold metal grating, so any movement would press her skin against biting steel. A rope winch had been rigged to lower it. Once inside, there would be no escape, not upward through the bars, not outward through the earth. The hatch above was designed to be opened only from the outside. The men moved quickly, though not without hesitation. They opened the cage, gesturing for her to step inside. She looked at it for a long moment, long enough that one of them shifted uneasily, as if afraid she might suddenly lunge or scream. But she didn't. She stepped in without a word, lowering herself to her knees because there was no other way to fit. Her head brushed the top bars. Her knees pressed into the steel floor. Chains clinked as they locked the door. Then, without ceremony, they began to crank the winch. The cage descended slowly, the sound of rope creaking and earth shifting filling the air. The hole seemed to swallow her whole. First her head vanished from view, then her shoulders, then the last glint of her hair disappeared into the shadows below. When the cage hit the bottom, the hatch above swung shut with a dull metallic thud. The sound echoed through the clearing. One man knelt and slid a small bucket through the opening in the hatch. A ration of water, some bread. Enough to keep her breathing for days, maybe weeks. The dirt around the hatch was packed down. Grass would grow over it in time. From above, it would look like nothing more than a patch of ground. It was a strange kind of burial. She was not dead, but she was gone. No sunlight would touch her skin again. No wind would reach her face. The only sound would be the distant, muffled noises from the world above. The crunch of footsteps passing by, the rumble of a cart on the nearby road, the occasional animal nosing at the hatch. Inside the cage, the air was damp and thick with the scent of earth. Every breath carried the taste of metal. The darkness was total. She could not see her hands in front of her face. Her body could never fully stretch out. Every position hurt after minutes. The human mind is not built for such isolation. Without light, the days and nights melted together. Without sound, thoughts began to echo in ways that could twist and warp them. In places like this, reality itself could begin to slip. And yet she endured. The first days were spent adjusting to the pain in her legs and back, the ache in her neck from always bowing her head. She sipped the water sparingly, ate the bread in tiny bites, letting it dissolve in her mouth. She learned to move slowly, so as not to scrape her skin against the bars. Above ground, life went on. The fields were plowed. The market opened each morning. Children laughed in the sun. The story of the cage became something people told over and over, adding details with each telling. Some swore she had gone mad the first night, clawing at the bars until her fingers bled. Others claimed she sat perfectly still, waiting, as if she knew something they didn't. Every few days, the hatch would open, and a bucket of water and a scrap of food would be lowered. No one spoke to her. No one checked her condition. Whether she lived or died was of little concern, as long as the punishment continued. But in the shadows of the town, a few people had begun to wonder if they had gone too far. No one dared speak it aloud in the taverns or the market. But in private, behind locked doors, the doubts crept in. What if she wasn't guilty? What if the real killer still walked among them? What if her silence wasn't defiance, but terror? Those questions would remain unanswered, for now. Because beneath the ground, the woman in the cage still breathed. And with every breath, the story was far from over. At first, time still had edges. She could trace them with the tip of her mind, run her fingers along the sharp corners of morning and night, hunger and relief, dread and the tiny mercy of sleep. The hatch would open above, a square of heavier black in a room of total black, and a slosh of water would break the silence. The bucket knocked against iron, a collision she learned like a language. She rationed in invisible measures, letting drops rest on her tongue as if water could remember how to be rain. Then the edges began to dull. Sound and sensation bled into one another until it was hard to tell whether a pain came from her body or the air around it. She found that suffering had a geometry. Knees pressed into the metal grid. Spine curved like a question mark that would never be answered. Ankles numb, then burning, then not there at all. Every shift produced new points of heat, new complaints from tendons that forgot how to lengthen. In the dark, the cage became a map and her bones the compass. She learned where to place her weight during the worst of the cramps, learned how to sleep in shards, learned that consciousness could be dismantled and reassembled with the care of a cruel craftsperson. Seasons still touched her, even underground. Winter arrived as a colder breath through the seams, a deeper thirst that water could not satisfy. Spring announced itself with the tick of beetles and a sweetness in the soil she could taste when she inhaled. Summer made the air heavy. It pressed on her chest like an invisible palm. In autumn, something in the world sighed. Even the roots above her seemed to loosen. She could feel the town shift through those seasons too, by the cadence of footsteps, by how often the hatch groaned, by the weight of the silence between deliveries. There were long stretches when no one came for days, or weeks, until the sound of rope, the scrape of iron, the ritual of keeping her alive just enough. She made rituals of her own. A litany of touch, bars, bar, hinge, corner, grate, seam. She tapped sequences, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, anything to chisel meaning into the void. She ran her fingernails along the iron and let the burrs teach her names for places that had no light. She discovered a chip in the weld where she could shred a thread from her dress, braid it with another, pretend it was a string she tied around memory to keep it from wandering. She counted the openings of the hatch. Then she counted the counting. When numbers lost their shape, she counted heartbeats, then breaths, then the faint thud of labor in the fields above. Sometimes the counting kept the terror at a distance. Sometimes it invited it closer. Hunger made a scholar of her. She learned the grammar of crumbs. She learned the syllabus of air. Some days she could swear there was yeast in the bread. Some days she tasted ash. The water varied too. Sometimes it was clean enough to vanish down her throat with a soft gratitude. Other times it held grit, as if someone had dipped the bucket in a shallow trough and let her drink the river's memory. A different hand delivered, she decided. The timid spill belonged to an older man with shaky wrists. The quick, careless splash belonged to a boy. The measured pour, the one that never spilled a drop, belonged to someone who had resolved to keep her alive without indulging in pity. Pity. She searched the dark for it like a coin fallen between floorboards. Some nights, when the hatch opened, a crust a little larger would descend. Once, a heel of bread still warm as if it had traveled from oven to rope without delay. On another night, a sliver of hard cheese came down, wrapped in an old scrap of cloth. She pressed the scrap to her face until the scent told her more than it should. Smoke, wool, a tang of tallow, the ghost of someone's ordinary life. She kept that cloth longer than reason allowed, rubbing it between finger and thumb until it frayed into fibers, until it became a rosary of nothing. Memories arrive louder in the dark. They brought the before life with them, crashing against the iron like waves that refused to retreat. The house with its clean boards and the way late sunlight made diamonds on the window. The garden where she had thumbed seeds into earth, believing each would answer. The small scar at the edge of her husband's lip, how it whitened when he drank too much, and certain words weighed more than others, fell harder than others, sometimes against her. These were not stories a town heard, not stories a court allowed. There was a reason her silence grew its own spine. In a life where speech had been a leash, withholding became the first act of possession. In the cage, that act changed form. Silence turned from a wall into a task. It was labor not to answer the voices that visited her, some imagined, some scraped together from memory, one or two perhaps real. Was there really a time, months or years in, when the hatch opened and someone lingered? She heard breath above, deliberate and near. She felt the air move, felt it as surely as rain. A coin slipped, clinked against iron, rolled, became a circle she touched because there were few proofs left that the world contained circles. The coin was smooth and thin, worn to anonymity by other hands. She kept it until she could not, until a fever took her and the coin became a heat source to press against her lips. After, she could not find it in the grate. The earth eats what it wants. Illness came in chapters. There was the cough that scraped her ribs. A fever that made her vision swarm with pale insects that did not exist. A stretch of days when she could not retain water and thought the end had crawled into the cage and settled beside her like a patient animal. She endured because endurance is sometimes not a choice but a momentum. In those chapters, she hallucinated the sky as a sound, a sustained vowel shaped by distance. She visited rooms she had never been in, walked floors more generous than the grid at her knees, felt the textures of imagined tables beneath her palms. The mind is an architect when the body is a ruin. Above, the town adjusted to the idea of a person buried within walking distance of market and church. At first, the cage was a rumor with teeth. People held it in their mouths and worried it like bone. They told each other they could feel the justice of it in their sleep. Years sanded rumor into furniture. The story became part of the town's fixtures. The cracked well bucket that always spilled, the blue door that stuck in damp weather. The woman who lived underground now, like a superstition you knocked on wood to appease. New families moved in and learned the tale from neighbors with the same friendly thoroughness used to explain where the road flooded in spring. Children grew tall and left, returned with wives and babies who screamed in the night for reasons unrelated to buried cages. The blacksmith's son took the forge and put his own hand to a hammer that had once shaped the bars that submerged her. Hammers do their work whether or not the wielder remembers the first blow. Not everyone forgot. Graves remember for us, and so do the living who choose to carry. A midwife, who had once seen the bruises a careful husband leaves, kept a little ledger in her head where debts are tallied the way seasons are counted. A priest, young and uncertain, found that the square of ground at the edge of the woods made his prayers stall in his throat. He avoided that path, then scolded himself, then avoided it again. A boy, more brave than wise, followed a delivery one night and lay belly down at the clearing's rim, ear pressed to earth. He could not hear a voice, only a feeling, the kind of quiet that presses on you until you want to press back. Years later, that boy would be a man with a daughter who refused to answer when anger demanded a reply. He would look toward the woods and think of pressure and of mercy withheld. Storms remembered her too. One autumn, rain stuttered for a week, then fell all at once. The creek fattened, gnawed at its banks, rearranged stones in its bed with a grinding complaint. A corner of earth near the clearing slumped. The hatch held. The rope darkened. The town woke to a smell of wet iron. For a handful of days, the air above her felt colder. The storms had pulled the skin back from the wound. Then men went out with shovels, tamped the ground, smoothed the surface like a bed pulled tight to hide a body's outline. Everyone liked a tidy world. Tidy worlds hold. Until they don't. There were days when she composed letters in her head. Not to the town, and not to the man whose blood had found a way into the boards. To a girl whose face shifted between the child she'd once been and the child she might have had. If the house had been a different house and the hand at the table had not clenched when it should have opened. Letters about seeds that answer, about windows warm with late sun, about bread still singing from the oven when you tear it. She folded those letters in the dark and placed them on an invisible shelf. The shelf grew. It became a library of unspoken things. The only library a buried woman could own. Time became not a line but a well. She would rise a little toward the rim when the hatch opened, fall back when it closed. In dreams she saw herself from above, a kernel in soil, something the earth might mistake for a root. She worried that she would become exactly that, a story that nourished other stories while her own never flowered. She told herself she would not allow it. But resistance requires an audience, and hers had moved on. It might have ended there. Bodies end even when stories refuse to. Yet the world is stitched by accidents, and sometimes a stitch runs. A stranger came to town on a late summer evening, with a limp that made dust rise in rhythmic puffs and a bag that clinked the way metal talks to itself. He had a trade, and with it a reason to ask questions. He needed iron mended, hinges reset, a particular latch replaced by a heavier design. He admired the blacksmith's work and asked about the joints. He admired the church door and asked about the carpenter's eye. He admired the town's order and asked about how such order was kept. He said he'd seen cages before, not buried, hung high. He spoke of a village 2 valleys over where a thief had swung above a road, a warning to others. He spoke without bravado, voice level, as if facts were simply the weather. He asked, at last, whether this place preferred its lessons in the sky or in the ground. That question walked through the tavern and into kitchens. It settled in people's throats when they lay down. It found the midwife, who had the memory ledger, and the priest, who avoided the path, and the man who had once been a boy with his ear to the earth. It found the blacksmith, whose hammer had split and reunited metal until he could not tell one seam from another in his sleep. Questions can be a kind of wind. They pick up loose things and carry them until someone must chase or let go. On the third night, under a sky rinsed clean by a brief storm, footsteps approached the clearing in a pattern she did not recognize. Not the timid shuffle, not the boy's hasty lilt. A deliberate pace. The hatch did not creak quite as it usually did. Someone had oiled it. The square of heavier black opened. She could feel, more than hear, that more than one head hovered above the hole. The rope moved, but nothing descended. Not bread, not water. Air came down first, cool as decision. Then a sound she had not heard in years. Metal against metal, not in confinement, but in invitation. A latch being tested, not secured. The cage, her world, her map, her geometry of pain, could feel such vibrations. She pressed her fingertips to a bar. The tremor told her something. A hand that knew iron better than most was considering a seam. Before the hatch closed, a single thing fell. Not food. Not mercy disguised as cheese wrapped in cloth. A small wrapped bundle, tied with twine that remembered rough palms. Her fingers found it in the grate. Inside, not a letter. She would not have seen the words, but a token. A strip of leather, stiff with age, and a button from a coat she had once mended, engraved with an initial that did not belong to her husband. In the town above, evidence was a word men used. In the dark below, proof was a feeling you could touch. She traced the initial with the blind care of a prayer. Somewhere in the world, there was someone who wanted the ground to open. Somewhere, a ledger in a mind and a seam in iron had aligned. The hatch lowered. The dark returned to its old kingdom. But now it held a fracture, a thin bright line running through it like a vein the earth had not sealed. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself a forbidden act. She shaped a name in her mouth. Not spoken, never spoken, only held there, until it warmed like breath against iron and became the beginning of an answer. The week after the bundle fell into the cage, the town changed its breathing. It was subtle, like a house that sounds different when someone starts packing at night. People walked slower near the meadow by the woods. Market talk had gaps. The church bell kept time, but between the tolls a hush spread. Order can be a costume. Once a seam loosens, everyone hears the fabric strain. Under her palm, the tokens became anchors. The leather strip warmed when fear climbed her ribs. The button sat like a small moon she could find in absolute dark. She traced the engraved initial until it woke an old route in memory. A coat on a chair, a needle finding daylight through wool, a table cleared too quickly because some tempers were clocks the whole house obeyed. The initial was wrong for her husband. It belonged to another, the man who treated decisions like property and the town like a room he owned. Names are fragile in a place that punishes the mouth. She kept his hidden between teeth, shaping it without sound until breath gave it weight. With the name came images, boots that never muddied, a ledger that swelled when favors were due back, the storehouse lock replaced after a break that smashed a door but spared valuables. Some men harvest reputation. They leave chaff in neighbors' throats. A stranger arrived with a limp and a bag that clinked. He fixed iron by day and watched doors in the evening. Not people, hinges. He studied how the town declared itself safe, the way latches sat, who carried keys, which hinges were freshly oiled. He asked questions that were not accusations. Who fitted that gate? Where did the strong box iron come from? Why does that barn door swing true when the ground swells? Questions like these loosen soil where secrets are planted. Within days, those questions had a direction. The same name kept surfacing in the pauses, the dead man's. Everyone knew he had died violently. Fewer considered that violence had threatened the town long before it reached his house. A midwife recalled small bruises she had read like weather. A priest remembered the texture of a confession without nouns. A blacksmith remembered a request for a spare key that made no sense, paid for in coin that smelled like the council chest. Whispers found one another. In the tavern, in the sacristy, behind the forge where sparks fell like impatient stars, fragments gathered, an argument through a thin fence, a donation recorded like a bill of sale, a note of credit discovered folded twice and stained with the sweat debt produces. Alone, each memory was smoke. Together, smoke became a map that pointed away from the simple story the town had swallowed. At the clearing, the hatch opened off schedule. The ration ritual had been indifferent. Now there were pauses. The square of darker dark lingered, listening. Metal touched metal once, not to lock, but to learn. She felt it through the bars the way a blind reader reads a spine. The hatch closed. No water. Expectation lowered itself into the cage like colder air. A rumor braided itself. The limping stranger was asking untidy questions about tidy men, and someone had been seen at the woods after midnight. In a town that runs on the unsaid, suggestion cuts deeper than accusation. A fire answered in the afternoon. It flared behind the storehouse, was beaten flat before it could taste the eaves. Flames ask where the water is, but they also point to wrong locks. In the wet, a latch hung crooked, replaced recently by a hand that worked quickly and wanted the repair forgotten. Hinge pins showed tool bites. A key not meant for that door had been coaxed to fit. Bad locks leave fingerprints you feel more than see. That evening, bread and water came down. Beneath the bread lay a small square wrapped in cloth. The parchment inside was stiff from damp, sealed once, broken, refolded by someone who could not keep their hands steady. She could not read, but parchment has topography. A pressed emblem had bruised it deep enough to be legible by touch. A circle, and within it a sheaf of grain. The mark on notes from the council chest. Debts recorded. Debts called. The choosing began there. Not publicly. Small rooms. Fewer voices. Words stripped to nouns. Key. Latch. Ledger. Blow. The priest opened a ledger and found a column that swelled when the dead man wanted leverage and shrank when he had it. The midwife brought what her hands remembered, a young wife whose silences arrived with ring-shaped bruises. The blacksmith showed a short length of iron filed the way a copy key is born. The town did not turn all at once. Some prefer the first story because it fits the furniture. But enough people found themselves awake at the same hour, looking toward the same patch of woods, and wondered if they had buried a fact with a woman. On the 10th night, the hatch opened to more sounds. Rope shivered. A small tool clicked against a tooth. Metal kissed metal with purpose. She pressed her cheek to a bar to feel the vibration translate into touch. A joint near the cage door answered differently than it had in years. Memory lives in old welds. Patient hands can locate where heat forgot its oath. Something dropped and settled between the grates with a polite chime. Not food. Not paper. A shaved sliver of brass. The cross-section of a key, cut to display its forbidden teeth. A map to a door above and a confession finer than ink. She kept it against the bar until its warmth left, as if cooling it could harden a decision. Decisions were indeed hardening. The boundary keeper, once the boy with his ear to the earth, walked the storehouse and saw the language of forced entry pretending to be accident. Under floorboards he found a hollow with no coins, only slips. IOUs in many hands, some steady, some desperate, some signed with an X. They formed a web radiating from the dead man's desk to the church box, to the tavern till, to the council chest with the grain seal. The limping stranger spoke less. He worked at the forge, then went to the clearing to oil the hatch so it would not betray those who would stand over it soon and choose. Events did not assemble a hero. They arranged themselves into reluctant courage. A farmer admitted seeing a figure leaving the house the night of the murder whose gait was wrong for the woman. A shopkeeper confessed to selling the dead man a bottle after hours and lying about the time. The man who oiled the hatch admitted to listening with his face in the dirt and hearing a silence that weighed more than soil. A plan formed like frost, quietly, along the edges. They would not yank at the cage and alert the faction that needed the first story to remain true. They would learn the door's weakness. They would gather ledgers, slips, and the brass sliver. They would ask the midwife to speak without names and the priest to choose the living over the comfort of rules. They would visit a back room where debts had been called and mercy arrived with conditions. Before any of that, they would signal the buried life. Not in words. In a promise the dark can keep. The hatch opened. The rope lowered. A thick card fell true. She found it and read with fingers. Embossed at the top was a small door ajar. Below it, raised from the paper like a pulse, a number. 3. Not a letter. Not a plan. A countdown. The town exhaled and tasted air that did not smell like fear. In the cage, her hand found the button again. The initial no longer burned. It steadied. The number nested beside it. She closed her eyes against the darkness with no light to offer and practiced an impossible motion, standing. On the first night, the number was 3. On the second, 2. On the third, the hatch opened to air thin with decision. The town was awake without admitting it. Windows were dark, but people were not sleeping. A bell did not ring, yet something assembled them, the quiet choreography of guilt and resolve. They went in small knots to the edge of the woods. Lanterns hooded, tools wrapped so metal would not announce itself. The limping stranger carried picks and wedges. The blacksmith brought a bar that could pry without shriek. The priest walked with hands steady, an oath made private. The midwife waited back on the path, a sentinel in case the first story returned with torches. At the clearing, they circled the hatch and let silence clarify what they were about to do. Punishment had become architecture here. To open the door would tilt a room the town had lived in for years. The stranger touched hinge pins he had oiled and felt how much fight remained. Not much. The blacksmith looked at the welds like an old sin signed in his hand. Work began. Pins slid with greased reluctance. Soil from the seams crumbled under patient knives. A folded coat waited on the rim to soften the lid's descent. They had rehearsed the motions in their heads until hands knew them. When the hatch lifted, the dark that rose felt like weather from below. The rope dropped, not as ration but lifeline. The stranger knelt, reached until fingers found iron, then a shoulder pared to angles by survival. Even prepared, he flinched. The body was all edges. Pain had taught geometry. Light found skin. She did not cry out. The rope burned, then held. 2 men anchored, another steadied, and the cage that had been a sentence surrendered its only occupant. When her head cleared the rim, air moved in her chest like a door unsticking. Stars and a thin moon gave permission. The midwife wrapped her in a blanket warmed beneath a coat. The priest found a pulse, stubborn, thin. The blacksmith kept his hands dirty on purpose. No one cheered. Repair does not like applause. They moved her to a cottage by the orchards where water steamed in a basin and bread softened in broth. On a table lay the small proofs that had survived the dark: a leather strip, the shaved brass, the wrong initial pressed into a button. Around them stood people who had learned to prefer witness to rumor. In the cottage, survival took its inventory. She drank, gagged, steadied, and drank again. Sleep and waking stitched together in short seams. Between them, she performed the work rehearsed in silence, choosing what to keep and what to let surface. When faces steadied, she lifted a hand and pressed 2 fingers to the button until the initial dented her skin. Then she shaped a name, not for spectacle or vengeance, but as a key placed on a table at last. Evidence made sound when it arrived. Ledgers thumped. Slips rasped. The brass shaving clicked, a crescent of admission. The stranger explained how copied teeth confessed the original. The midwife described what the body records when peace is performative. The priest spoke about sins that become structures. The blacksmith laid his palm on the bar he had brought and said nothing. His silence now agreed with the opposite of what it once served. The men from the square entered with authority arranged like armor and found the room would not carry it. They saw a woman their town had buried and was now keeping alive. They saw signatures in ink and in bruises. The first story, good at standing upright, leaned. After that, events refused simplicity. Some wanted the old solution, return her to the ground and call the rescue treason. Others insisted on the new difficulty, let her live and let the town bear itself. A shove could have become a blade. It did not. Years of silence had trained them to respect quiet. The priest argued that witness is the only mercy that changes anything. The midwife held a gaze until a man looked away. The stranger's cane tapped once, measuring the floor's resolve. A sequence replaced compromise. First, she would not go back underground. Second, the ledgers would be read to those they bound and those who benefited. Third, the practice of burial as punishment would be named in church as sin and in council as crime. Fourth, the dead man's house would be examined not to cleanse, but to learn. Angles of impact documented so anyone could see what a small frame could and could not have done. Fifth, the storehouse and council chest would account for coin and grain in front of those who had paid with fear as well as money. The town did not summon distant authority. They did the closer, harder thing. Stood in the square, named the first story, and named why it was wrong. The bell rang for inventory, and records replaced rumor. She was not paraded. The cottage remained shaded. Food came in broths. Hands learned the slow grammar of care. The midwife tended places where iron had fretted skin. The priest read words with edges sanded down. The blacksmith sat without speaking, a watchman of repair. The stranger mended other hinges by day and returned at dusk to tighten the one inside the cottage because safety, too, is a structure. The empty cage lay on its side like an animal that had died poorly. Some argued to melt it, others to keep it as warning. They set bars like iron commas into the churchyard wall, punctuation that demanded an answer. Children would ask what the commas meant, and adults would have to answer. Healing arrived like weather. Scars mapped the old geometry, but new muscles learned other tasks. Speech returned as tide rather than flood. She did not give speeches. She allowed facts to sit beside other facts until pattern introduced itself. First the doorway, then the garden. Later the orchard's edge where roofs did not feel like a crowd. On a morning of thin sun, she pressed the button into her palm and let its initial leave a mark that meant closure rather than threat. Not everyone agreed to carry the same version. A few left, taking with them a story that blamed correction for humiliation. In other valleys, the tale hardened into something that kept its tellers comfortable. Elsewhere, punishment by ground persisted in whispers. The stranger, hearing of a cage 2 ridges over, shouldered his bag and said he would be back if iron and will allowed. He left a tool behind on purpose, in case the town needed to open something again. The unearthing widened beyond the hole. People listed smaller silencings practiced in ordinary rooms. A widow spoke about accounts kept in another man's hand. A boy confessed to being the runner who watched the hatch and not knowing what to do with what he felt. The bell rang for courage rather than ceremony, marking hours in which truth stepped forward not to punish but to keep future doors from requiring secret keys. When she chose to cross the cottage threshold without escort, the path she took was not toward the square or the church wall with its iron punctuation. She went to the edge of the woods and stood over ground that had once been ceiling. She touched earth with the sole of her shoe, as if testing whether it would accept her weight as a person, not a problem. The town stood far enough back to grant privacy and near enough to announce accompaniment. The blacksmith held his hat. The priest kept his hands quiet. The stranger stood at a respectful slant, as if guarding an opening not yet visible. No speech was required. Leaves adjusted into a single sound that made evening feel comprehending. She lowered herself to sit. Knees remembered the old geometry and declined it. The sky held. Nothing happened for a long time, which is the opposite of what a spectacle demands and exactly what a life deserves. The cage was gone. The ground kept its negative. The town had begun the long task of carrying what it had buried. Somewhere beyond the ridges, another valley still told a first story, and a door there needed a different key. The stranger would go. Others might follow. A tool lay where it could be found. In the pause before the next storm, something denied for years finally took a breath and did not give it back. What lingers is not the cruelty of a single night, but the ease with which a community mistook silence for guilt and punishment for order. The cage was built of iron, yes, but also of convenience, reputation, and the soft lies people tell to keep their days arranged. When the hatch opened, it wasn't just a woman who rose. It was the debt the town owed to truth, carried into air where everyone could see its weight. If this story unsettled you, sit with that feeling. Ask what your town, your feed, your circle calls justice when it really wants quiet. Ask which doors are locked by stories repeated too often, and who holds the copied keys. If you want more strange, forgotten histories that won't leave you alone, subscribe and stay with this channel. Leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest or the question you're still turning over. And if you're ready for another descent into the past's darker rooms, watch the next documentary cued at the end of this video. History remembers what we bury. Sometimes it remembers louder than we do.